4th of May, 4 days to victory. Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and Easy Company move ever closer to a deadly showdown in the mountains with the fanatical SS. The silence is menacing. They could be driving into a trap. Their nerves are on edge.
Yeah, sure, it's scared. I don't care how big and bold and bad you think you are, you know, you still got, if you're not like this, you're crazy. You had no business being there, you know. But, yeah, we all had the same idea that, Jesus, so close into the war, I hope I get through this, you know. I expected to fire a lot of guerrilla pockets, you know, hit and run ambushes, you know, stuff like that. Pure guerrilla warfare. You come out behind trees or tower trees all over the place, you don't know where they are.
Meanwhile, in the north, just after 5 p.m., a delegation of top German officials visit Field Marshal Montgomery. The day before, he refused their offer to surrender only to the west. Today, they sign an unconditional surrender of all forces facing him in northern Germany. The surrender is signed at 6:30 p.m. and comes into effect the following day, the 5th of May, at 8 a.m.
This was really the sort of pinnacle of his career, in a way. I mean, here was he, having started as a very junior officer in 1908, when he was commissioned from Sandhurst, receiving the surrender of 2 million of the nation's enemies. So it was a very moving occasion for him.
News of the capitulation hasn't reached the front lines. Commando Cliff Morris and his comrades are preparing to capture the Baltic port of Kiel. In a couple of days, he'll be out of a job. He writes in his diary.
Today we have passed through Lübeck and have finally arrived at Neustadt, where we are staying in large marine barracks which were used for living quarters by camp staff. This time it has been a walkover and a joy trip for us. White flags were hanging everywhere and Jerry troops were surrendering in their thousands.
While the war staggers to an end all over Europe, Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and his comrades in Easy Company must still complete their dangerous mission in the mountains. "5th of May, 3 days to victory. In the ruins of the German capital, there's hardly any food left. Its inhabitants have been reduced to eating whatever they can find. People are forced to sell whatever they have left in order to buy what little is still available. Even bread is scarce and expensive. 2 slices must last a whole day. While the Russians ransack Berlin, its people are starving.
Entschuldigen Sie. Bitte.
That same morning of the 5th of May, Flight Lieutenant John Curry of the Royal Australian Air Force returns to his base in England. It's his 3rd food drop to Holland this week. With up to 500 drops a day, the Allied pilots have managed to save thousands of grateful Dutch people from the German-imposed famine.
They could sense then that they were going to be liberated very soon. They really went wild, excited, and they were on the roofs and waving through the top stories of, the old Dutch buildings are 3 or 4 stories, and you'd see these people up on the top stories waving the things. It was a great feeling. You could almost feel it, coming from the ground, and the appreciation that they were showing.
During the 10 days of the airlift, over 11,000 tons of food are delivered to Holland. But for many, it is too late. Some 20,000 people still die of starvation.
Well, on the 5th of May, the German occupation of Holland comes to an end. General Blaskowitz, the German commander-in-chief, finally surrenders in the presence of Prince Bernhard. And after 5 years of occupation, Amsterdam is also liberated. Today, the first British victory salvo of the war is fired at Montgomery's headquarters as the ceasefire in northern Germany and Denmark comes into force. All over Europe, German armies are collapsing.
And when I arrived at Merchant's Garden, I was apprehensive, scared. The war's about over and I want to live, you know, so you put extra senses out there. Really thought there was going to be a shootout there, but they all had their little white flags out there, but that don't mean nothing, you know, real quiet. But, you know, when it's real quiet, you worry more, there's a lot of noise.
Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and Easy Company reach their final destination.
This is way too quiet. Might be a trap.
They have endured 11 months of relentless combat since D-Day. This is their last mission. They must get through it alive. Against all expectations, they take Hitler's mountain retreat without firing a shot. With no last stand in the Alps, is this at last the final gasp of the dying Nazi regime? May 1945. At 2 a.m., two powerful Nazis, General Jodl and General Admiral von Friedeberg, arrive at Allied headquarters. The day before, Eisenhower refused their offer to surrender only to the West. Today they have instructions from Grand Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor, to sign the unconditional surrender of all German forces. This confirms the total defeat of the Third Reich. It is signed by representatives of each of the Allied countries. All hostilities will cease at 11 p.m. on the 8th of May, 1945. World War II in Europe is officially over. News of the end of the war is greeted with riotous celebrations in the Allied and liberated countries. The Russians sign the German surrender a day later, and on the 9th of May, Stalin declares the war is over. And just as it was foreshadowed on the 25th of April, an Iron Curtain then comes down, dividing Germany and Europe in half. The Cold War is about to begin.
Well, the Third Reich is no more, but for the inhabitants of Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, it might seem as if they've simply exchanged one totalitarian overlord for another. Montgomery and Churchill, of course, are horrified. They both believe they won the war but lost the peace. And even in the hour of victory, Churchill's filled with foreboding, and he writes later, the Soviet menace, or so it seemed to me, had already replaced the Nazi foe.
For Gerda Pettersson and many East Europeans, life under the Soviets is one of hardship and repression.
So I had to work in a military hospital, carry dead babies away, and I had to clean, and it was a hard time as long as the Russians have been in our part of Berlin.
But on the 8th of May, 1945, the future seems bright and free of the dangers and deprivations of the last 6 years. The horrors of the war are past, and people can get on with their lives. General Eisenhower goes on to become the 34th President of the United States. He dies in 1969. Montgomery is given the title First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He's then appointed Deputy Commander of NATO. He dies in 1976. Flight Lieutenant John Curry returns to Australia after the war, where he works as a reporter and then in public service. He lives in Perth, Western Australia.
It was a sort of very mixed feelings when it ended, because we'd been training for 3 or 4 years, and the match was called off. You know, it was sort of it was a bit of a shock. You were out of a job.
Commando Cliff Morris returns to England in 1945 and enjoys a successful career as a boxer, as well as working in the baking industry. He lives in West Sussex, in the south of England. After the war, Italian partisan Urbano Lazzaro moves to Brazil, Many years later, he's now back in Italy and lives in Piemonte. American paratrooper Clancy Lyle goes on to fight in Korea and Vietnam. He lives in Maryland in the USA.
I stayed in the service, so the only thing saved me was the Korea War. It brought me back to reality again, you know. But we had a lot of people that just couldn't make it.
German Army telephonist Rokas Misch is tortured and interrogated in Moscow before serving as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. He is then sent to Siberia for 9 years. He now lives in Berlin. Russian gunner Vasily Ustikov stays on in Berlin as part of the Soviet occupying force until 1946. He retires from the Red Army a lieutenant general in 1985. He lives in Moscow. Farley Mowat goes on to become Canada's most widely read author. He publishes an autobiographical account of the war in 1992. He lives in Port Hope, Canada.
The war is an act of absolute lunacy. Not just partial lunacy, but absolute lunacy. And it may be the most distinguishing feature of the human species as an animal, that we are subject to this terrible, terrible kind of lunacy. From which the ultimate conclusion that I drew, and I have retained it, is that it is probably the symptom or symbol or diagnostic indication of the way we are going to end.
When the Americans finally arrive in Berlin in July 1945, Gerda Pettersson is relieved to discover that her home is in the American sector. But she falls in love with and marries a doctor from East Berlin and lives there through the long, hard years of the Cold War until Germany's reunification. She and her husband still live in Berlin.